Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Can everybody hear? Good. Okay. So the talk I'm going to give today is a paper that I did for something called the Gordon Commission on the Future of Assessment that Eva Baker was a member of, and so was Luis Gomez, who is also here with us today. And the paper is available. I think there's a link to it probably on the CRESST website. So if you're interested in more detail, you can consult that paper. The title of the talk is Preparing for the Future, What Educational Assessment Must Do. And I'll begin the talk with a very brief description about how I think education is changing. And then for the body of the presentation, I'll make 13 claims about what educational assessment must do in terms of goals it must satisfy if it's to remain relevant in the face of these changes. And for most of these 13 claims, I'm really going to skate along the surface and not get into a whole lot of detail because you couldn't in the amount of time I have to speak. But at least that gives an overview of the kinds of issues that I think are going to be important in negotiating this future. Although the focus of my remarks is on K-12 education, I'm going to touch on higher education too, because what's happening in higher education I think is going to have profound effects for schooling at the K-12 level. And then finally, I'll just summarize my remarks. There can be little doubt that education is changing. It's changing along several dimensions simultaneously. For one, it's changing to anywhere, anytime electronic delivery. Witness the enormous growth of free courses, educational games, and simulations delivered on personal computers, tablets, and mobile phones. Education is changing to include the development of new skills like problem solving with technology, accessing and organizing information from large databases, which are all over the internet, and remote collaboration. Finally, education is changing to allow individuals to personalize their experiences, to take the courses they want to take when they want to take them, and to get certified that they've mastered the targeted competencies. To remain relevant, educational assessment must change too. It must keep pace in at least the 13 ways I'm going to talk about next. Most important and most obvious is that to remain relevant, educational assessment is going to have to provide meaningful information to at least three audiences. Education policymakers need summative information about the general effectiveness of education systems and the preparedness of populations, as well as about the performance of specific schools, teachers, and students. Teachers and students primarily need formative information about how to plan and adjust instruction to improve learning. And parents need both kinds of information. Information about their children's progress and about how to help their kids succeed more certainly. This need for meaningful information is going to become more acute as the world economy becomes more globalized, because among other things, being competitive in a globalized economy means having a world-class education system capable of producing a skilled and productive workforce, as well as the informed citizenry needed for meaningful participation in a democratic society. A world-class education system, in turn, I think presumes high-quality assessment. In other words, the need for high-quality assessment is not going to go away. In fact, I think it will become only more pronounced. My second claim is that educational assessment will not only have to provide meaningful information, but it will have to do so for multiple summative and formative purposes, similar to the ones that I just mentioned. It should be obvious that this diversity of purposes cannot possibly be satisfied with a single test, because an assessment built for one purpose is not going to necessarily be suited to those other purposes. Building an assessment to serve many purposes isn't going to work either, because an assessment built for multiple purposes may be optimal for none of them, in the same way as a Swiss Army knife is not very good for anything. It's used in a pinch when you have nothing better. Multiple purposes might best be served by different related assessments designed to work in synergistic ways through modular systems of assessment. As you may know, modular systems are being created in the two main Common Core state assessment consortia, PARC and Smarter Balance, which represent most of the states. The two systems are very similar in their key features. The system being developed by Smarter Balanced includes formative tools, processes, and exemplars to help teachers and students plan and adjust instruction on a day-to-day basis. Interim assessments to evaluate student progress over longer periods, and summative assessments to document for all concerned, including policymakers, whether students have met more global proficiency expectations for the year. The point again, different assessments for different primary purposes. Third, to be effective, the assessments of the future will need to be grounded in modern conceptions of competency, that is, the knowledge, processes, strategies, and habits of mind required for success in a given community of practice. For example, automatization of lower level skills to free up cognitive resources for higher level processing. Knowledge organization to allow efficient retrieval of information. Representational fluency to permit easy translation among different ways of expressing knowledge. And transfer to allow learning in one context to be easily used in others. Additional examples include collaboration, using technology for domain-based problem solving, applying competency in real-world contexts, and motivation, persistence, time management, and other personal attributes. We test relatively few of these competencies deeply and directly today. In fact, the learning sciences basis for most educational tests is long outdated. The Common Core state standard should have a positive impact in this regard, pushing test developers toward the use of more modern conceptions. Fourth, the assessments of the future will need to align test and task designs, scoring, and interpretation with those modern conceptions. Among other things, this claim implies that educational assessment will need to go well beyond the traditional item formats to include simulations and other performance tasks that better replicate the real-world conditions under which integrated competencies need to be displayed. Discrete tasks that include both innovative selected response ones and short constructed response ones will additionally be necessary. Those tasks help decompose complex performance for formative purposes, and for summative purposes help reduce the impact of unwanted task effects like local dependency and lack of generalizability, which have been repeatedly found to limit the interpretive value of performance assessments. And in fact, both the PARC and Smarter Balanced designs call for such a combination of discrete questions and integrated performance tasks. Because these Common Core state assessments will include performance tasks and other open-ended questions, there's going to be great strain on scoring resources. Consider this potential scenario taken across the two main consortia. At least 2 extended written responses per student, taken by some 26 million students, graded independently by 2 human judges, with resolution needed by a third rater for large discrepancies, say in 5% of cases, resulting in some 114 million human readings annually. And that's only for the extended written responses. Many shorter open-ended tasks could also require human scoring. To put that level of demand in perspective, ETS conducts about 26 million human essay readings annually across all of its testing programs, less than a quarter of this new level of demand. Given the enormous prospective demand, it should come as no surprise that some commentators have viewed the sole use of automated scoring as a magic bullet solution to this grading problem. In fact, automated essay scoring is already used operationally in a number of high-stakes tests. The revised GRE General Test, the Test of English as a Foreign Language Internet-based test, the Graduate Management Admission Test, and the Pearson Test of English, but typically in conjunction with human raters. Among the benefits are the obvious ones of speed and cost, but also explainability in terms of being able to examine why a response received the score that it did, and construct control in that what is measured can in principle be manipulated by differentially weighting the automatically extracted response features. Among the disadvantages are limited construct coverage, susceptibility to exploitation by unscrupulous examinees, and negative washback. These disadvantages occur because existing systems measure only low to mid-level writing features, some of which are both easily manipulated and not necessarily in isolation legitimate targets for writing instruction. Essay length is an example. If your writing is both grammatical and conceptually bankrupt, saying more is unlikely to make it better, but it may well increase your automated essay score. I want to point out that some vendors are more willing than others to publicly acknowledge what their systems can and can't do. Consider the following vendor descriptions. Software scoring programs like CRESST do not independently assess the merits of an essay. Instead, they predict very accurately how a person would have scored the essay. The benchmark suite uses advanced artificial intelligence techniques to mimic how professional scorers grade essays. The E-Rater engine predicts essay scores based on features related to writing quality. AutoScore uses a black box proxy approach, a statistical predictor of how humans would score to a rubric rather than direct scoring to the rubric itself. So you see the theme here: predict, mimic, predicts, predictor. Consider those descriptions, contrast those descriptions with this last one. IEA can understand the meaning of text much the same as a human reader. Even with the word understand in quotes, this description implies a fundamentally different assertion than the others, and I would argue a misleading one. If we're honest about their capabilities, then, when used consequentially, these systems ought to be paired with carefully trained and carefully monitored human raters, at least until the systems are capable of more directly measuring the essential features associated with modern conceptions of writing competency. Fifth, we need to adopt modern methods for designing and interpreting complex assessments. At its heart, measurement is about three things: creating opportunities to observe performance in the situations that require competencies we're interested in, connecting those observations to meaningful characterizations of individuals, groups, or institutions, characterizations that are assumed to inhere or at least adhere to the individuals, groups, and institutions we're interested in. And then finally, estimating the uncertainty associated with those characterizations. Modern conceptions of competency and complex tasks, however, pose very significant challenges for measurement. For example, computer-based performance tasks, like the ones that will be delivered through PARC and Smarter Balance, call upon multiple competencies simultaneously. They may generate huge amounts of response information, including about solution processes. They may introduce irrelevant sources of variance, perhaps skill in using the computer interface to respond. And they may be complicated, time-consuming, and very costly to produce. The need to manage these design and interpretational challenges has motivated the generation of new methods. Structured design methods attempt to help developers manage cost and complexity and ensure focus on intended competencies to the exclusion of unintended ones. Assessment engineering and evidence-centered design are examples, reductive adaptations of which are only just beginning to be used in the design of large-scale testing programs. With respect to interpretation, there's much activity around methods for analyzing complex performance. These methods may help us make better sense of the potentially voluminous student data and multifaceted student data that these new assessments will provide. Of particular note are methods like data mining, which in a structured design process would be used more for exploratory purposes than for operational scoring itself, and multidimensional item response modeling, which ultimately would be used operationally to implement the results of a structured design process. That is, to index some particular set of latent competencies and their proposed organization. The sixth claim is that tests of the future will have to do a better job accounting for context. Large-scale summative tests are designed to assess out of context. They essentially ignore the social, learning, and teaching environment for an individual in an attempt to produce inferences that are generalizable across contexts. How a student performs on such a test and the score he or she receives is a fact, but why the student performed that way is an interpretation requiring knowledge of context. We attempt to account for context in our consequential decision-making in very, very basic ways. For example, in university admissions, we include high school grade point average, letters of recommendation, and personal statements. In national and international assessments like NAEP, TIMSS, PISA, PEARLS, we use school, teacher, and student background data. Those data help to give meaning to out-of-context test scores by suggesting possible explanations for why students or groups may have performed as they did. For classroom purposes, however, we need a much closer and far more thoughtfully designed connection to context if we're going to make inferences about how to adjust instruction for a particular individual or group. Embedding assessment into the learning context, that is, more closely integrating it with curriculum and instruction, ought to make results more actionable because the content, the knowledge representations, and the tools called for by the assessment are the same as the ones used in the learning environment. Such embedded assessment will become largely unavoidable as anytime, anywhere electronic learning environments become pervasive, bringing embedded assessment with them. Whether summative or formative, assessments of the future will need to be designed for fairness and accessibility. In most democratic societies, equal opportunity for individuals, as well as for members of traditionally underserved groups, is a social value. That social value has been reflected in standardized tests, however, to widely varying degrees. Fairness for individuals dates to the ancient Chinese imperial civil service examinations, which were instituted to distribute government jobs based on merit rather than on political or family connections. In the US, concerns about fairness for groups were voiced very early on in the history of testing, though they weren't acted on for some groups until much, much later. For example, as early as 1930, the principal and inventor of the SAT observed that tests in the vernacular must be used only with individuals having equal opportunities to acquire the vernacular of the test. For less privileged students, at least, a first step came just a few years later when Harvard instituted use of the SAT for awarding scholarships, the purpose being to increase the economic and regional diversity of its undergraduate student body, a major shift from the institution's past policy of drawing students almost entirely from expensive, private college preparatory schools in the Northeast. Sadly, some population groups were discriminated against for many more years by test developers as well as by test users. That tragic legacy assures that as long as assessments are used, fairness will be an issue, even for formative purposes. For example, across population groups, a formative assessment, whether you consider it process or instrument, should do three things. It should provide similarly meaningful inferences about student competency. It should suggest similarly sensible instructional adjustments. And all other things equal, it should lead to similar levels of instructional improvement. If not, the formative assessment could turn out to be more effective for advantaged than for disadvantaged students, thereby increasing existing achievement gaps, which would be a very unhappy and arguably unfair result indeed. Note that in principle, it's possible for formative assessments to be more effective for some population groups than others and be differentially prescribed in the same way that some pharmaceuticals are population targeted. That situation would leave it to the free market to create assessments specifically for underserved groups, an eventuality that left to the free market might or might not ever come to pass. Eighth, educational assessment will need to be designed to have positive impact. We know that test design can negatively affect the behavior of individuals and institutions by, among other things, encouraging a focus on a narrow subset of the intended curriculum. If tests can have a negative impact, we ought to be able to create assessments that have the opposite effect. For example, assessment should be designed to be a valuable learning experience. First, if the assessment faithfully represents the curriculum, students should learn by preparing for it. Studying the appropriate material should help students develop fluency for basic procedures, consolidate their knowledge, and organize it in ways that facilitate retrieval and connection to conditions of use. But second, students and teachers should benefit from experiencing it because summative and formative assessments should model good teaching and learning practice, thereby helping individuals to improve how they teach and how they learn. Tests can model, excuse me. Tests can model good teaching and learning practice in several ways. One way is to give students something substantive and reasonably realistic with which to reason, read, write, or do mathematics or science. As an example, the typical US writing assessment asks the student to compose rapidly in response to only a short prompt, a writing context that's virtually unique to standardized testing, and in that sense quite artificial. In contrast, the experimental writing assessments we've been working with have a mini project structure in which students delve into a topic before they write about it. In this middle school example, the student must explore the topic of whether junk food should be sold in school by reading, analyzing, critiquing, and summarizing material from a variety of sources, all before writing an essay on that topic. This notion of writing from sources is a key component of the Common Core state standards. A second way we might try to model good practice is by including tools and representations similar to ones that proficient performers tend to use. Proficient performers typically have internalized standards and criteria that they employ to evaluate their own work as well as the work of others. Our experimental English language arts assessments include such standards for the particular literacy forms that students are being asked to produce. Here's an example of guidelines for summarizing an article. The guidelines communicate the elements of a good summary, which students must apply in evaluating faulty summaries we give them and in generating summaries we ask them to construct. These same guidelines appear in both summative and formative assessments. Our goal in repeatedly presenting the guidelines is to get students to internalize them, to make them a habit of mind. In addition, we hope that teachers will internalize them, incorporating them into their routine instructional practice. Third, we might try to connect qualitative or conceptual understanding with formalism. This math assessment prototype presents middle school students with a scenario that requires the application of mathematical reasoning to a policy problem. The policy problem relates to whether emergency water conservation measures should be put into place because of a drought. To make a policy recommendation, students must work with the mathematics surrounding the flow of water into a lake and its outflow through a dam. That outflow produces electricity and irrigates the land downstream. Electricity production and irrigation will be compromised if the water level in the lake falls too low. This problem obviously depends on understanding the incidental concepts of inflow and outflow. To introduce those concepts, we give students a simulation of a sink, which every student is familiar with. That allows them to vary the state of the sink basin, representing the lake, the state of the faucet for the inflowing river, the state of the plug for the dam. And students can experiment with varying those states and seeing what happens to the water level in the sink. From that experimentation, and by answering a set of associated questions, we try to give students a qualitative sense of inflow and outflow, after which we bring them back to the problem of the lake and the dam and of modeling that problem mathematically. A fourth way we might try to model good teaching and learning practice is to use lead-in and culminating tasks to suggest to the teacher how the skills required for more complex performance might be decomposed for instruction. This summative writing assessment contains 4 tasks, each of which involves multiple items. The first task presents a set of readings and asks the student to summarize the arguments made in those readings. The second asks the student to analyze an argument in terms of the evidence provided for and against that argument. The third task asks the student to critique an argument by evaluating the accuracy and logical sensibility of the evidence provided. The last task asks the student to present his or her own point of view in an argumentative essay, success in which presumes, among other things, being able to summarize arguments, analyze them, and critique them. The idea behind this structure, then, is to help identify for the teacher some of the critical skills students need to develop if they're to be able to write effectively in this argumentative writing genre. Finally, we might use theoretically grounded and ideally empirically supported learning progressions to denote and measure levels of change in student understanding. By learning progression, I mean a description of qualitative change in a student's level of sophistication for a key concept, process, strategy, practice, or habit of mind. Change in student standing on such a progression may be due to a variety of factors, including maturation and instruction. Each progression is presumed to be modal, that is to hold for most but not all students. And finally, each progression is provisional, subject to empirical verification and theoretical challenge. Learning progressions then suggest an ordering of topics for instruction that is meant to follow the sequence most students are believed to traverse in developing a particular competency. This hypothesized English language arts progression focuses on reasons and evidence, one aspect of argumentation. The progression has 5 levels. At the primary level, the student can infer whether reasons would be used to support or oppose a position. At the basic or middle level, he or she can distinguish between reasoning that seems convincing because one agrees with it and reasoning that seems convincing because of the content of the argument itself. And at the highest or advanced level, the student can identify and question the warrants of arguments and synthesize a position from many sources of evidence. Here's a set of questions targeted at that lowest or preliminary level, specifically at whether a student can infer whether reasons would be used to support or oppose a position. Students have to read each statement and indicate whether the statement gives a reason for or against the sale of junk food in schools. If students can't do well on a task like this, they're never going to write an argumentative essay, or at least they're not going to be able in their current state of skill development. In this middle or basic level task, we ask students to evaluate a hypothetical letter to the editor that contains factual and logical flaws. Task attempts to measure whether students can distinguish between reasoning that seems convincing because they agree with it versus reasoning that seems convincing because of the logical structure of the argument and the factual accuracy of the information. Building formative and summative assessments around theoretically grounded learning progressions ought to encourage teachers to become familiar with those progressions and hopefully use them to improve their instructional practice. Ninth, in a world where many students appear to be glued to mobile phones and electronic games, educational assessments will need to be designed for engagement. Designing for engagement doesn't mean that all assessment should be fun, because success in learning and in vocations takes effort, and sometimes effort is not so much fun. That said, assessment results are more likely to be meaningful if students give maximum effort. Engagement should be enhanced by posing problems students are likely to care about, providing motivating feedback, employing delivery hardware that they prefer, where that hardware is appropriate to the task demands of the domain, of course, and by using multimedia game elements and perhaps even games themselves. What's the attraction of games? The attraction is that games are addictively engaging, that games can replicate important real-world activities, the quintessential example being war games. And finally, that in replicating those activities, games can call upon a wide range of competencies, including complex academically and professionally related ones. Take, for example, epistemic games, which are intended to encourage development of the knowledge processes, strategies, and habits of mind important to success in a given disciplinary community. Here's a case in point developed at the University of Wisconsin-Madison by David Williamson Schaefer and colleagues. In this game, players work as urban planners to change the look and feel of Madison, Wisconsin. They listen to people's concerns, redesign the city, and present their findings. Players learn about ecology, develop self-confidence and presentation skills, and start to see the world through the eyes of a problem-solving urban planner, the epistemic part. The attention being given educational games is quite remarkable. Note the headline of this recent USA Today article, White House Office Studies Benefits of Video Games. It's the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and that's Constance Squire, who's responsible for the office's games portfolio. Note this announcement for the National Summit on Educational Games on the Federation of American Scientists website. And this display on the Nobel Prize website. You don't have to be a genius to understand the work of the Nobel laureates. These games and simulations based on Nobel Prize awarded achievements will teach and inspire you while you're having fun. This seemingly intense interest has motivated the establishment of both corporate and academic research centers dedicated to educational games. Here, the Microsoft Research Games for Learning Institute, and here, the Center for Games and Impact at the Arizona State University. Given all this excitement, why not simply embed assessment into educational games? Such a strategy could work for formative assessment if the game calls upon competencies that are relevant outside the game, and if gameplay generates meaningful information for adjusting instruction in or outside the game. But couldn't that same information also be used incidentally for making consequential summative decisions? Why not just use performance in the game as the evidence for having the competencies of interest? Why not use that evidence for student promotion and graduation, for teacher and school evaluation, for college admissions, and so on? And in fact, some commentators like Bill Tucker of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have suggested that this very idea, an electronic record of game performance, will lead to the end of testing. Bill Tucker's provocative argument, of course, applies equally well to online educational activities more generally, not just games. edX, founded by Harvard and MIT, offers free online courses, so far to about 500,000 users around the world. Large numbers of students have also registered for so-called massive open online courses from competitors Udacity and Coursera. Electronic records of performance potentially go well beyond games and online courses to ebooks, which are scheduled to replace paper text in Florida's public schools by 2015, and potentially in schools throughout the United States, as advocated here by Arnie Duncan. This discussion of games and electronic learning environments more generally leads to my 10th claim, which is that educational assessment will need to respect privacy. In a technology-based learning environment, be it a game, a MOOC, or an ebook, information can be gathered ubiquitously, that is, everywhere. It can be gathered continuously without end, and it can be gathered surreptitiously without you as student even knowing it. Something Val Shute has called stealth assessment. In my view, individuals should know when they're being assessed and for what purposes, but especially when the purposes are consequential in nature. Further, ubiquitously gathered information should be used for formative purposes only, because teaching and learning behavior may be negatively affected if every single action has consequences. No teacher or learner wants to be constantly observed and constantly judged. learning and teaching involves the freedom to experiment, which includes the freedom to make mistakes. In essence, using formative results incidentally for consequential purposes may wind up undermining the effectiveness of both formative and summative assessment by shifting the focus of formative assessment from improving learning and instruction to cynical attempts on the part of teachers and students to game the system. A more sensible approach, I think, would be doing what's done in sports. That is, to use separately identified periods for consequential assessment versus learning or practice. In baseball, for example, practice periods take place during spring training games, and in regular season, between games and between innings. What counts is restricted almost entirely to within-inning play during those regular season games. If we use this sports metaphor in education, students and teachers would know when they were being assessed for consequential versus learning purposes, and they would know when they could experiment in their learning or teaching without fear of negative consequences. How might such a system of separately identified learning and consequential testing periods work in a world where students are getting their education remotely through MOOCs? edX, Coursera, and Udacity are collaborating with the education publisher Pearson to allow students to take consequential exams at proctored testing centers. A bit old-fashioned, to be sure. More 21st century is that some 200 colleges and technical schools have hired a company called ProctorU to administer summative tests that students can take remotely on the same webcam-enabled computers they use for their MOOCs. That is, Proctor's monitor test takers in real time via the webcam. And in a landmark decision, the American Council on Education announced on February 7 its first endorsement of a MOOC. The Council endorsed 5 such courses, thereby advising its 1,800 member colleges that they can be comfortable conferring credit to students passing any of those courses. Notably, all of the endorsed MOOCs use summative tests overseen by ProctorU. 11th, educational assessment will need to incorporate information from multiple sources because a single test occasion cannot measure a competency domain both broadly and deeply. All assessment methods, be they tests, interviews, observations, work samples, games, simulations, portfolios, have limitations. As a consequence, result from multiple assessment occasions and multiple methods integrated in a principled manner are likely to provide a far more meaningful characterization of individuals and institutions than could be obtained from a single occasion or method alone. That's why ultra high-stakes testing programs like the United States Medical Licensing Examination and the Architect Registration Examination use both multiple methods and multiple occasions. For education, this array of assessment information will need to be gathered inside and outside of traditional learning environments because that's where education will occur. 12th, educational assessment programs will need to continue to gather and share validity evidence. Legitimacy is granted to a consequential assessment program by a user community and by the scientific community connected to that user community. That grant of legitimacy rests upon several things. It rests upon honest evaluation, including independent analysis of the meaning of assessment results and of the impact of that testing program on individuals and institutions. It rests on effective protection against corruption and fraud. It rests on transparency in how scores are generated. And here I should note that keeping secret how some automated essay scoring programs work which some vendors do, is inappropriate when people's life chances are at stake. The user community has a right to know how such systems generate their scores. Finally, legitimacy rests on continuously feeding validity results back into the improvement of the assessment program. Last, educational assessment of the future will need to use technology to achieve substantive goals. That is, to do what can't be done as well or at all with traditional methods. Measuring existing competencies more effectively and efficiently, measuring new competencies, including ones that require the use of technology, and having positive impact on teaching and learning. I can't emphasize this 13th claim enough. Our focus should not be on technology, no matter how seductive, alluring, attractive, and compelling and revolutionary it might be. Our focus should be on using that technology to materially improve assessment and through that, teaching and learning. To summarize, I claimed that education is changing quite dramatically and rapidly in some cases and places. I also claim that to remain relevant, educational assessment must change too. It must keep pace by satisfying the 13 goals listed here. Many of these goals are ones to which assessment programs have long aspired. However, meeting even those long-held goals in the face of an education system that will be digitized, personalized, and possibly gamified will require significantly adapting and potentially reinventing educational assessment. Our challenge will be to retain and extend foundational principles, applying them in creative ways to meet the information and decision-making requirements of a dynamic world and the changing education systems that must prepare individuals to thrive in that world. Thanks very much for your time and attention.